Welcome to Eyes on Books. I'm so glad you're joining us this morning. I'm Elaine Schnitter, and my co-host is Steve Savlov. I think you're really going to enjoy hearing about this book. We're going to tell you a little bit about the story, and then we're going to have you join us while we interview the author. The title of the book is The Echo of Old Books, and the author's name is Barbara Davis. Steve's going to start off by telling us a little bit about the story. Okay, Steve.
Well, to begin with, I want to say that I really love this book.
Yeah, me too.
In fact, I read it twice. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of twists and turns, and interestingly, people have to read it, but it all comes together at the end.
Yes, it's worth plowing through it.
Plowing through it, right.
Yeah.
One of the protagonists, or one of the main characters, is named Ashlyn. Excuse me. And Ashlyn, as a little girl, grew up in a very dysfunctional family. Her parents would have these knockdown, drag-out fights. And so Ashlyn, for her own protection, was drawn to go to a bookstore where the owner of the bookstore, Frank Atwater, was very supportive of her and provided, I guess you would call it, a shelter for her. And Ashlyn found out early in her life that when she's with certain books, that she had this energy that comes from the books in her hands, in her arms, in her chest. And they called that psychometry, this ability to focus on the previous owner energy, whoever had this book before. So now Ashlyn's parents, when she was 16, the mother did not accept chemotherapy for her cancer, and the father shot himself.
On her 16th birthday, during the party.
Right, during the party.
Poor girl.
Very sensitive there. Anyway, eventually, Mr. Atwater died, and his wife died, and they left the bookstore to Ashlyn. And so she took over this bookstore, and she became a binder, where she would take old books and put them back into good condition. And she would, and also she sold, old books. And she would get boxes of old books from other bookstores, and she would go through them, and she eventually came upon two books that really gave her a tremendous amount of energy.
Yeah, quite a jolt, right?
Quite a jolt. So she was intrigued by these two books because there was no author, and there's no copyright or anything on it. And she was curious about who wrote them, and why was there no copyright? And it turns out, not to get into what Elaine's going to talk about, but it turns out it was written by a man. One was written by a man. His name was Hemi, for Hemingway, although he was not Hemingway. And the other one was by Marion, who he called Belle, B-E-L-L-E. And apparently they had a falling out, and they both were writing a book about what happened from their point of view. So, again, not to give away the story, but as Elaine will explain, she'll try to tie these two together. Ashlyn eventually, through her, I would say, sleuthing, was trying to locate who the authors were and why there was no copyright.
And where the books had come from, because they were just in a box.
That's right. That's right. So while she's doing this, she meets a man named Nathan, who has, who actually is related to the woman who apparently wrote the one book. And so he's kind of intrigued about, you know, what his relationship is with her and where she's located and so on. So the two of them put their heads together and, you know, try to track down Marion or Belle. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to
Well, you've pretty much set the whole thing in motion now. As you said, Ashlyn and Ethan start investigating these books. They're reading them together. The time period is 1984. So what they find out is that these books were written in 1941. So the author does a really wonderful job of telling two stories in two different timelines, but it's so well tied together and so smooth that it doesn't affect you. You're just going along with it, and it's really a pleasant read. And as Steve said, he hated to put the book down, and I was the same way. After I finished reading it, I kept looking at it and thinking, oh, I want to read more, I want to read more. There should be more here. So at any rate, Ashlyn and Ethan read these two books together, and what they find out is that the authors, Hemi, which is a pseudonym, and it's a nickname that Belle, which is a pseudonym, gave him because he was a journalist, a writer, a British writer. And he just felt she was beautiful and referred to her as Belle. Now, the books are written by each one of them. So the really puzzling thing about the two books, they tell the same story about this romance in 1941, New York City, but they are two different conflicting stories. The stories contradict one another. And as readers, we're kind of left with the question about what is this? What really did happen? So the author does a wonderful job of winding in this mystery. And she gives history and mystery and romance. And apparently that's her hallmark. She manages to do that with all of her books, which is a wonderful way to write a book. And 1941 was just before the United States got into World War II. And the author does a nice job of explaining the political climate at that time and also the class differences. Hemi, a journalist, gets involved with Belle, who's from an extremely wealthy family, one of the elite families in New York City. So there's quite a striking difference in their backgrounds, but they do fall in love. And unfortunately, it becomes a tragic love story. And by the way, as this progresses, Ashlyn and Ethan form a relationship. So essentially, we have a story within a story. So you have 2 stories for the price of 1. BOGO.
Yeah, it's a real page turner. I mean, I couldn't wait to find out what happens.
And the author does a wonderful job of tying all the loose ends together. Mm-hmm. And it is kind of, in the end, a surprise to us. There are a few things that cause us to speculate on what might have really happened, but we don't really know until the end. So that's another good way to keep someone turning the pages.
Yes.
Yeah. So now what we would like to do is turn our little program over to Steve, and he's going to introduce Barbara Davis, the author of The Echo of Old Books. And I'm sure we're going to have a nice conversation with her.
We're privileged to have an interview with the author of The Echo of Old Books, Barbara Davis. And I'm Steve Savlov, and my co-host is Elaine. And
Barbara.
First of all, I want to say that we both loved your book. In fact, I read it twice. And we were sorry that it actually stopped because we wanted to read more.
Yeah, yeah.
And hopefully there will be a sequel. I don't know. So anyway, we're going to ask you some questions. We just reviewed your book, The Echo of Old Books, in covering, Ashland and Hemi and Marion and so on. And so just wanted to ask you, what were your influences in writing this book?
Everyone always wants to know what inspired me to write this book. And the truth is, when I get an idea for a book, I get the whole idea.
You get the what?
It sort of lands on me out of nowhere. I know the beginning, the middle, not quite the end, but right up to the end. I know the setting. I know where it'll take place. I get the whole thing. So I don't know where that comes from. I'm very grateful for it, and I hope it never stops. 'Cause if I had to, are we good?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. If I had to come up with an idea from scratch and piece it all together, I don't know if I could do that because every book I've ever written has come to me in that way. Just one big bolus of information. I always knew I wanted to write a book about books that seemed to talk to one another, but I didn't have a vessel. I didn't know what that conversation would be about. So it was sort of just in the back of my mind, on the back burner. And then one day my husband and I were out for a ride and boom, here came the idea. And I said, go home, I've got the idea. And when I told him what I was thinking about doing, he thought I was crazy.
Well,
he's supportive, but he did wonder how I was going to pull that off. So did my editor.
did a wonderful job.
Yes,
Thank
you
you.
sure did. And you were originally a Jersey girl, although it sounds like you did grow up in Florida.
Yeah, I am a mixture of everything.
Yeah.
South, Northeast.
And New Hampshire, I do have family in New Hampshire, and I had been to Portsmouth. So reading about the shops was very real for me because I remember walking through those little shops, and actually I brought something home to California one time it wouldn't fit in a suitcase. It was this big wrought iron thing that held serving plates for a buffet, and I don't know why my husband agreed to buy it because we had to lug that thing all the way back to California. So that's my memory of Portsmouth. And the location, I mean, it really resonated with me, you know, very much so. And of course, New York City, since I'm a Jersey girl originally.
There you go.
And I agree with Steve, I really was sorry when the book ended. I kept looking over at it and thinking, oh, I've got to go back and see what happens next. So it was very, very compelling, and I appreciate that from you, really.
Thank you. It would have been longer if they would have let me.
Yeah, it could have been longer. We wouldn't have cared, right?
Right.
Well, I keep telling my publisher that, and they, you know, they want you to. I already sort of go past where they like me to go. Well, going, you know, pushing that envelope any further is really.
Yeah.
I don't think I get the approval for that, but I could write chapters and chapters more.
Well, I did listen to it on Audible, and I also read it, and then I combined the two while I was taking notes on it. And there was a lot. I ended up making out a family tree so Steve and I could see who was related to who as we were reading.
Fun.
Yeah. But one of the things I loved, Barbara, was the fact that you started the chapters with quotes, the chapters, Ashlyn's chapters and Marion's chapters. And the quotes were wonderful, and they were your quotes. I mean, some of them were from other famous authors. However, most of them were from you, and this bulk of information that lands on you full steam. So how do you do that? What's your process with the quotes?
I am a frustrated, not a frustrated, I am a wannabe self-help writer. So this is my way of like still being able to get my little tidbits of wisdom in there and my motivation and little ideas that I live by personally. And I tried to match them up with, and I did this also in my book, The Keeper of Happy Endings, where there are quotes at the beginning of each chapter that are about marriage and relationships. And in Echo, I tried to make it about healing and scars, and because she was a book restorer, I tried to mix the two, kind of emotional rehabilitation with book rehabilitation, and kind of lay them over one another so that the quote would work either way.
Oh, all right. Yeah. And I was wondering which came first, the chicken or the egg, if you wrote the chapter and then wrote the quote.
I kind of wrote the quotes on their own because I knew what the trajectory of the story and the emotional pieces that I wanted to have in the story. So I kind of came up with the quotes with that in mind. Oh. But then once I wrote the actual chapter where the quote was going to go, I sometimes tweaked the wording, or sometimes I even said, no, this belongs for this chapter, and then I'm going to borrow this one and put it over here. So it was a work in progress. It was a moving target. It kept changing a little bit here and there.
Well, it's a wonderful touch. I really liked those quotes. They were very nice. And having them supposedly from Ashlyn's book that she wrote, that made it even more interesting. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
I have a question about, are there any personal things that come out in your book that, like from your experiences or, things that you've experienced that influenced your writing?
I think all authors borrow from their own lives, their own experience, their own, emotional scars, because we all have them. I think each character that I write is very different from who I am, but I also think that little bits of me creep in there. For instance, Ashlyn's first marriage. She was married to someone very manipulative and very similar to my first husband. So I definitely farmed those emotions when I was writing that character. I had he was an emotional hostage taker, and that's how I saw her husband. Like taking a hostage and holding her hostage with, if you don't do what I want, and then at the end pay her back. That was something that my husband threatened to do. So that definitely came from a place of my own experience. He did not, but he threatened constly to do that so that I would have to live with that, after I left. So that part definitely was from me.
Yeah, that was a scary part of her life. The poor girl had so many scars from every part of her life, and she seemed to do well with Ethan. She was very suspicious at first. She was reluctant to be in a relationship, but they seemed to get along.
And with anyone, even with friends, she didn't want to even hire anyone into her business. She just didn't trust anybody to get close to her.
Right.
And there was a good reason for that. There really was. And she did find her solace in books and in binding books and taking care of books. So she was quite an interesting character.
Yeah, I loved writing her.
Yeah,
I
bet you did.
Her layers and her growing out of scary place into the possibility of having a new different kind of a life.
Did you have any influences on her being a psychometrist?
Here's a little tidbit. I didn't know that was a real thing. I thought I made it up. I swear, I thought I made it up. I was really proud of it. And then all of a sudden somebody said, hey, I know somebody that has that. And I'm like, wait, what? Yeah, it's called that. I'm like, oh no. But then the fun part of that was I got to go do the actual research on how that science was discovered and how it evolved and who wrote the books on it and who came up with the name. So I got to put some real science behind it, which was very fun.
Right.
And a surprise, because I literally did think I made that up.
Well, as a profession, I was a clinical psychologist, and we had psychometrists, but instead of having that particular ability, they actually are ones who administered and evaluated people with psychological tests. So I just thought that was interesting that they using the word for both.
There's always something fabulous that I learned that I didn't know when I go into a book. Even if I think I've done all the research, as I go through it, I will have to look something up or whatever, and then this wonderful little Easter egg pops up that I wasn't expecting to know. And sometimes it's something I can use, and something it's just something that I will now carry around that I know, which is still I love, because I love to learn what people. My brother calls me the font of all worthless knowledge. I love collecting factoids and just like being able to pop something out that people haven't heard of and make them think a little bit.
How fun for you. That's wonderful.
Yeah, I'm a big old nerd. At some point, it's some silly thing I ran across in my research.
It just popped out. Yeah, you have some active mind, Barbara. You really do. Just goes in a lot of directions, doesn't it?
It does, too. Yeah. And unfortunately, it doesn't always shut up when I want it to. I can sleep, it's still going, and I'm like, stop.
So I guess our closing question is probably one you get all the time, I'm sure, is are you working on something right now?
I am actually working on book 10. Book 9, which is called Every Precious and Fragile Thing, comes out in February.
Oh, congratulations. Wow.
That one is, thanks. That one is just about in the can. I'm just doing the last bit of proofreading. I should get that any day from my publisher. And then I am working on a book called The House at Bitter End, which is a generational story that starts out and moves through generations of women who the matriarch was hung as a witch. back in 1734, and it's the generations that have come after and how all of that has affected the family.
So do you normally try to write a book with two different timelines or even more than two timelines?
All of my books are dual timeline. This one was, I don't know, triple timeline, I guess, which I will hopefully wisely never do again. It was very hard to write. It was very hard to switch gears and to tell, the same story in two different ways through the eyes of two different characters, and still have the reader understand this is the same party, this is the same dinner, but you're seeing it from the other side of the table. So that was a challenge, to not make it boring, like, oh, we already know this, but to have it feel very different emotionally based on which character was telling the story. Because in all relationships, there are two sides, especially every breakup. There's always two sides of how it happened. So that was a challenge. But yeah, this next book will be the book that I'm working on now, and will have multiple, it will go through generations. But there will be a current story, and then we will roll through the second timeline, will roll sort of chronologically through the history timeline.
Interesting. Nice. Well, I guess we just need to thank you very much for joining us, and we know our audience will love this book. We've already been telling people you've got to read this. It's so interesting. So I hope your new one does well, and your one in the works eventually. Do you have a book out like about every 2 years? Is that what you
About
normally?
every 12 to 16 months, depending on. I keep finding harder and harder things to write, so it takes a little longer to get them to work. But it's usually about a year and a half. One every year and a half is about what it's come out to be now.
Well, good for you. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, I really appreciate your input and getting to know you as the author.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. Our audience will also appreciate it.
My pleasure, and I thank everyone for reading.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I love to read.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed hearing about our book, The Echo of Old Books, and also I hope you enjoyed our interview with Barbara Davis. She's certainly someone that we have never experienced before, someone who actually gets a book full-blown coming right into her lap. So it was very, very good interview, and I hope you enjoyed it.